Good Camp Fiver. Yeah, looks like somebody here. All right, I'm going to get into the topic of opiates, opioids. I guess you could use either term. I searched the internet for the answer to that question, the difference between opiates and opioids. And there is a difference. The opiates are those substances that come from the natural opium poppy, not synthesized or semi-synthetic opioids. Opioids include all of them. Opiates are just those like morphine and codeine that come directly from the opium poppy. The opioid class of drugs, the O in podcast, are a class that produce pain relief, blissful sleep, and euphoria. That's the blissful part. There you go. The opiates run the gamut of the schedules of control, with codeine on Schedule 5, tramadol on Schedule 4, Vicodin on Schedule 3, OxyContin on Schedule 2, morphine as well, I believe, and heroin in Schedule 1. All of those are opiates derived from the opium poppy, except fentanyl, which is synthetically created in a laboratory based on the chemical formula for opium. The history of opium takes us back 6,000 years to the Middle East, and it has been used, as far as we know, ever since as a medicine, for pain relief, and as a recreational drug to derive pleasure. The plant is scientifically named Papaver somniferum, but we simply know it as the opium plant. And it's a flower which has a bud that, when mature, can be scraped and a white liquid will ooze out. That liquid is collected, and that has the chemical that contains the opium that has been used and treated over the years to create all the different types of opiates. The pill form of OxyContin, Vicodin, tramadol, Percocet as well. Come on, pup, come on. Don't mess with the big birds. Something over there. As well as the IV drugs, heroin and morphine, and the synthetic fentanyl is just based on the same chemical. It's simply, I think in the 1970s was discovered how to make that in the laboratory without having the opium poppy. In terms of ancient use, in Egypt, 1500 BC, the Ebers Papyrus, a famous script, describes the use of opium. In Greece and Rome, it was known to be used around and just before the time of Christ. In the Arabic world, around the time at which Muhammad was becoming popular and the Islam religion is growing, around 1000 AD, opium was used as a social drug. And in Europe, after trade started to develop again around the 15 to 1600s, the so-called Age of Exploration, that was a new era of drugs, including opium, being introduced to Europe. In Europe, it was frequently used as a additive to other drugs like alcohol, and was made into tonics and pills that people could take. It was given the name laudanum, and I'm not quite sure where that comes from. I'll have to look up the etymology of that term, laudanum, and is written about by a number of famous English writers and poets like Tom de Clancy, who wrote The Confessions of an Opium Eater. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and famous for her poem, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Kubla Khan and Rime of the Ancient Mariner. All were inspired by opium. In the 1700s, the global trade started getting pretty hot. India was exporting opium legally through the British East India Company, made famous by their teas and coffee trade. They were the first multinational, as we learned in the last section. Hey, baby, come! As we learned in that last section of the course. That dog. All right, good girl. You stick with me. They were also exporting opium out of China, which was an illegal trade. And it went on for a number of years, decades. The illegal trade got bigger and bigger, and then China decided to shut it down. That's when the opium wars broke out. Looking at the types of opium that have been developed from that opium poppy flower and its derivatives, its active ingredients, if you will. They were isolated in 1806, and once isolated, morphine, which is the main active ingredient in opium, in that white fluid that comes out of the bud of the flower at the right time, morphine is 10 times as potent as the raw opium, which you could put into a mixture and take as a tonic or inject, or well, the injection doesn't start until after the hypodermic syringe is invented. That's not till, I believe, 1867. I'll have to look that one up. But earlier, another alkaloid or component of the opium, black tar, also contains an alkaloid called codeine, which is the Greek word for poppy head. So that makes sense. So codeine and morphine are originally known to exist by the 1830s. Useful in medicine, and particularly in these wars that continue to break out in the 1800s as a result of colonialism. It is frequently used as a salve and pain reliever in the wars of that period, and continues to be today. 1853 is when the hypodermic syringe is invented. I had that in my notes here. In 1898, Bayer Pharmaceutical Company starts a project to change morphine a little bit and add a certain compound to it called an acetyl compound, which already exists on the structure of the chemical morphine. But when a second one is added, it's called diacetyl morphine, and that was given the name heroin, because it became, it increased the strength of the morphine, and it's 3 times as potent as morphine, heroin. And so heroin was marketed as a new wonder product, new wonder drug, Bayer Aspirin Company. It lasts until 1912 before it's taken off the market, because the drug is leading to addiction. The Bayer Aspirin Company, when they released it, said no known dependency or addiction issues existed with the drug. So here we start in 1898 with perhaps the first of a series of malfeasances, misdirections, or just plain lies coming from pharmaceutical companies that claim that their drugs do one thing or won't do something, and they end up not doing it or doing it. So drug testing regimes developed in the 1900s to the point where we have, government oversight to the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, overseeing pharmaceutical companies to a pretty strict degree, depending on the administration that chooses whether to or not to follow regulations. So, heroin is taken off the market in 1912, and it becomes a street drug, not particularly popular until the 1950s and 60s. And the 60s, of course, an era when many drugs were becoming popular again, if they weren't already. Marijuana, heroin, and then a new drug, LSD, that came on the scene in the 40s and 50s. And that was a hallucinogen. We'll talk about that in next week. Talk about that next week. LSD. So, these opioids, heroin. Now fentanyl. I've got to look up the history of fentanyl, but I believe it was discovered in the 1970s to mimic effectively the diacetylmorphine compound, but even more effectively than the heroin drug. It is, I believe, 10 times, maybe 20 times more powerful than heroin in its effects on the human body. So that's related, of course, to the overdose deaths that we'll talk about shortly. Speaking of which, patterns of opioid use is the next topic. And opioid dependence wasn't viewed really as a major social problem until the late 19th century. And that's when it started to impact state law. And then by 1914, the Harrison Act goes into place, which starts to restrict trade, and it also starts to tax certain drugs like cocaine and heroin. And throughout the late 20th century and early 21st century, we've seen heroin rise and fall in popularity. But the other forms of opiates that have become extremely problematic, in addition to heroin and fentanyl still, are the pills that were produced by Purdue Pharma, the prescription opiates. OxyContin is one of their products. Percocet, I believe, is a product that they owned. I believe Vicodin and Tramadol as well. But these opiates were truly illegitimately pushed into the medical community in a way that did not benefit patients at all. In fact, it did active harm to them. So the aspects of OxyContin, Percocet, Vicodin that are harmful involve, again, the dependence-forming qualities. So it's the Bear Aspirin story all over again, but at this time it's the 1990s. It's Purdue Pharma 100 years later, and it's their insistence on getting marketers to push doctors using bogus arguments like any doctor that leaves their patient in pain is a bad doctor, and therefore you need pain relievers, and the best pain relievers are their pills. So in the 90s, this has started a whole revolution of pain management using opioids, which led to people becoming hooked on opioids. And so when that started to be recognized by the government, they made opioids harder to get through regulation, and started to really put their thumb on Purdue Pharma. And then the pills got harder to get. But what was still available, of course, on any black market, there's always availability, was heroin. And it was in the 90s and early 2000s that fentanyl started to be the product that became attractive to global drug black marketers. And the fentanyl being cheaper than heroin and more effective started to replace in some quantities in some places and markets the heroin, or at least parts of the heroin, it was introduced into the mix, and as a result, people did not use it correctly. This is the risk of a black market purchase, of course. You don't always know what you're getting exactly. No regulations or federal oversight in black markets. So that started an overdose epidemic itself, and that led to a third wave in the late 2010s, around 2016, 17, 18, 19, that peaked again. In this case, sometimes the intentional use of fentanyl, but not dosed properly. Throughout those three waves of opioid abuse, dependence, and overdose, over 500,000 people died between 1999 and 2020, basically a 20-year period. You may be curious what the life of a heroin user is like, a dependent user. Essentially, once hooked on the drug and experiencing withdrawal effects, the user needs to get heroin into their body in some form, or opiates into their body in some form, within 3 or 4 hours of their previous dose, so roughly 3 or 4 times a day. That dependent habit forms as a result of the withdrawal effect, pushing negative reinforcement, and very difficult to break. Now, the withdrawal effects of opium are on a chart there. Craving for drugs and anxiety with heroin or morphine after 6 hours. Yawning, perspiration, running nose, teary eyes after 14 hours. Increase in above signs, plus pupil dilation, goosebumps, tremors, hot and cold flashes, aching bones and muscles, loss of appetite after 16 hours. The shaking starts. Increased intensity of above, plus insomnia, raised blood pressure, increased temperature, pulse rate, respiratory rate and depth, restlessness, and nausea, 24 to 36 hours. So after a day of not getting heroin, a user or any opiate, regular dependent user will start feeling these symptoms, and that will mean they kind of will present as if they're sick, like with the flu or something, right? The nausea, the shaking, the temperature, irregular temperature, all those things might be the flu, but could be heroin withdrawal as well. After 36 to 48 hours, increased intensity of above, plus curled up position, vomiting, diarrhea, weight loss, spontaneous ejaculation or orgasm, hemoconcentration, increased blood sugar. I'll leave it at that. In terms of the toxicity potential, we do, of course, know that it is deadly to overdose, but how much, and that's difficult to say. It depends on the user, depends on physical features of the user, weight, body mass, body fats, etc. Depends on the drug that's being taken exactly, how it's taken, how much is taken, obviously, but it's highly dependent on the situation, so it's not something you can just measure out easily. There are test kits to see if you do have fentanyl in the heroin or if it's been cut in some way that you're not expecting. But other than that, it's up to the user to know their dosage and not exceed it to the point where it's so much that they stop respirating, they stop breathing. That's the dulling effect of opium. It dulls the nervous system so that such that you stop. You go. It's not like a depressant per se. Well, in many ways it is, but it is in its own category, of course, because of the differing effects from depressants, the sleepiness or narcotic effect. Not hypnotic like the benzodiazepines, but narcotic, truly a sleep agent. But a kind of dreamy sleep, this blissful sleep I described it as earlier. You can counteract the drug with a opioid antagonist. This is called naproxone, or naloxone, or Narcan is the brand name. So you may have heard of Narcan. That is available in all the dorms. It's available throughout the campus. I understand we are one of the first student campuses to have very comprehensive reaction kits for drug overdose. So that's a good thing. Narcan, it immediately negates the opiate receptors that are causing the slowed breathing and the activation of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Very, very toxic. Gotta watch out for that. The end of the presentation talks about Afghanistan and opium and highlights the growing region in the southern provinces of Afghanistan were large-scale growing areas for opium, and the opium trade coming from that region in the period between 2001 and 2018, 2020, I believe. That period was a period of warfare, of course. We went to war in Afghanistan to get rid of the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11, and remained there to try to change the country. And that was a failure. Should have learned from the Soviet experience in 1986 to 1990. One of the events that led to the demise of the Soviet Union was their attempts to take over Afghanistan. The warriors there, the war leaders, the tribal leaders known as the Taliban, collectively were very sophisticated at kind of guerrilla rogue warfare. They had weapons that we had shipped them in the 1986 to 90 Soviet war so that they could fight off the Soviets, because they were our enemy in that period. And they were using those weapons against our own troops at the early parts of the war. They had to resupply, of course, and they used opium as a economic tool in order to gain the access to the money they needed to get the weapons to fight the U.S. in the 20-year war that ended pretty spectacularly poorly for us. For everybody, truly. War is never good. Yes, a little cultural aspect, recent cultural aspect of opium and its effect on international relations and warfare. Here we are at the river. Beautiful day here, although a little cooler than last week. But we're going to move on with High Price in just a moment, or perhaps a couple hours, with a fire in the fireplace tonight. All right, see you there. Say hi, Phoebe. Cutie. Big yawn for you. There you go. Good girl. Hi, so we're back with Phoebe and Luna and the fire. And it's High Price time, chapters 14 and 15 tonight. Chapter 14, hitting home. is very much about identity, I think, is the theme of that chapter. Really trying to understand one's identity as you move from position to position, status to status throughout your life, move through society, really, and socially construct yourself in a way that reflects the roles that you play and the institutions that you belong to. So Hart, having developed himself quite radically from his youth to his adulthood, goes back to his home and has difficulty in translating that experience, moving from one culture to another, if you will, and having an experience that is authentic in both, truly. That struggle is really a big part of what he talks about in this chapter, and the struggle is not just with his trying to communicate with his family at home as a member of the tenured faculty at Columbia University, but it is also a struggle with the other tenured faculty at Columbia University, who as down and laid back as they might be, are not black men with dreads and 3 gold teeth, as he describes himself. And so, there's always a struggle with the kind of racial and ethnic tension that exists in society. What's interesting is that the chapter doesn't talk much about drugs. This is a chapter largely devoted to, again, that sense of identity, but even that can be segued in to the conversation. Another aspect of identity that comes up in the chapter is the idea of parenthood and family extending into the future. As he mentions at the end of the last chapter, he discovers he has a son that was born in when he was 16, and he did not become aware of it until he was much older, and already had 2 sons before he had actually met this earlier progeny of his, young man named Tobias, 21-year-old, and I guess the only real relationship to drugs that the chapter has is the discovery that Tobias, who he meets initially at a funeral, and they both go tell each other to go fuck themselves. Pardon my French. But Tobias comes back and introduces himself more informally. They get to talking, and Carl Hart learns that his son from another mother is a drug dealer. So there's the relationship to drugs again. He describes him as having the life that he would have had if he hadn't left Miami Gardens and gone into the Air Force, and then gone to get his degrees. So that's hitting home. Chapter 15, The New Crack, makes comparisons between the crack era and methamphetamine, which was growing in popularity in the early 2000s and up to 2010 when he was writing. The chapter starts with a description of his attendance at a conference where he's trying to present scientific information in the midst of a lot of anecdotal stories about meth, which didn't square with his understanding in his research of the drug. And this really motivates him to recognize that the public is widely uninformed about drugs and how they work, largely depending upon news stories and the media, as well as personal anecdotes or things that they've heard, rumor, often spread on social media today, about drugs and drug effects. And this cycle, he seems to think, goes on decade after decade, but with different drugs. In the 1980s and early 90s, it was crack. In the early 2000s, meth. Today, of course, it would be fentanyl. So be wary of how drug use and drug risk is portrayed in the media, because it's not always scientific. He does a really good job in this chapter, I think, highlighting that notion and giving lots of evidence about how stories can be misconstrued by the media, how science can be misconstrued by the media as well, where journalists don't really understand how a study works and what it's proving, often misciting statistics and causing a misinterpretation of the risks and harms of certain drugs. So I think that's a good lesson to take out of this chapter. Okay, moving on with assignments. Assignments this week are to do the chapter quiz on opioids, do the discussion, choose a perspective in the discussion, do the online media about the opioid crisis, and a bi-weekly journal catching us up on chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, I believe. Check the assignment to be sure. All right, so thank you. We'll catch you on a warmer day, hopefully. It did get very cold earlier this week, so hope you are staying warm yourselves and you are hanging on to your winter jackets at the moment. All right, see you next week.